Heavy rain lashed down on the cobblestones of Wabash Avenue, masking the frantic, uneven footsteps of a woman running out of time. At exactly 3 a.m., the heavy oak doors of an exclusive, subterranean lounge violently gave way. She didn't seek a hero. She merely sought the dark. The interior of the Ironwood Club was a study in controlled opulence. Located beneath the bustling streets of Chicago's Loop, the speakeasy was a fortress wrapped in velvet and mahogany. At 3:15 a.m., the club was officially closed to the public, leaving only the scent of stale cigar smoke, expensive perfume, and the faint, rhythmic hum of the city's subway lines vibrating through the foundation. Lorenzo Moretti sat in the center of the room at a secluded corner booth, a crystal glass of Blanton's single-barrel bourbon resting loosely in his grip. Dressed in a sharply tailored charcoal Brioni suit, he looked every bit the legitimate venture capitalist he claimed to be on paper. In reality, Lorenzo was the undisputed head of the Moretti family, a syndicate that controlled everything from the city's shipping ports to its underground casinos. Across from him sat his underboss, Matteo, a towering man with a thick beard and eyes that never stopped scanning the room, even when it was entirely empty of strangers. They were reviewing a stack of heavily redacted shipping manifests when the tranquility of the room was shattered. The heavy, reinforced steel door leading to the rear alleyway delivery chute, a door meant to withstand a battering ram, slammed open with a metallic crash that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. Matteo was on his feet instantly, his hand darting beneath his jacket to draw his Glock 19. 3 other men stationed around the perimeter of the room drew their weapons in unison, the cold clicks of safeties being disengaged cutting through the silence. Lorenzo didn't flinch. He merely set his bourbon down and raised a single, silencing finger, halting his men from turning the intruder into Swiss cheese. Through the doorway stumbled a woman. She was soaked to the bone, her trench coat plastered to her skin, her dark hair tangled and plastered against her face. But it was the way she moved that caught Lorenzo's immediate attention. She wasn't just stumbling. She was systematically dragging herself forward, one agonizing inch at a time, one hand clamped desperately against her lower abdomen. Between her fingers, a dark, unmistakable stain was rapidly spreading across the beige fabric of her coat. She collapsed to her knees, her breath hitching in ragged, wet gasps. "Hold your fire," Lorenzo commanded softly, his voice carrying an unnatural weight. He stood up, his polished dress shoes making slow, deliberate sounds against the hardwood floor as he approached her. As Lorenzo stepped into the dim amber light, the woman forced her head up. Her face was pale, devoid of color, but her eyes were a piercing, defiant hazel. She didn't look at the guns pointed at her head. She looked straight at Lorenzo, instantly recognizing the man who commanded the room. "You're Moretti," she choked out, her voice trembling but surprisingly clear. "You're bleeding on my floor," Lorenzo replied, his tone devoid of any visible empathy. "And you bypassed a keypad lock that is supposedly unpickable. Who are you? And who is hunting you?" She swallowed hard, grimacing as a fresh wave of pain washed over her. Her free hand, trembling violently, reached into her coat pocket. Matteo tensed, aiming his weapon squarely at her chest. "Easy," she whispered, pulling out a small, metallic Kingston encrypted flash drive. She held it up as if it were a talisman. "My name is Chloe Sanders. I'm a forensic auditor for Deloitte, and I have the offshore account numbers for Alderman Richard Hayes and his entire network. The men chasing me, they aren't thugs, they're CPD." Lorenzo's eyes narrowed. Alderman Hayes was a prominent thorn in the Moretti family's side, a corrupt politician heavily backed by the Tarasov Bratva, Lorenzo's most bitter rivals. If Hayes fell, the Tarasovs would lose their political shield in Chicago. "Why bring this to me?" Lorenzo asked, stepping closer, towering over her. "You should have gone to the feds." "The feds are on his payroll," Chloe gasped, her arm beginning to drop as her strength waned. "You're the only one, with the guns and the grudge, to stand in his way." She looked up at him, her vision clearly beginning to fade. "If I die, the encryption locks permanently. A dead man's switch. Save me, and I give you Chicago." Her eyes rolled back, and she collapsed entirely, her cheek hitting the floorboards with a soft thud. The flash drive clattered across the wood, stopping perfectly at the tip of Lorenzo's shoe. The room was dead silent, save for the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. "Boss," Matteo warned, his voice low. "If dirty cops are hunting her, they're sweeping the grid. They'll ping her phone, check the cameras. Keeping her here is an act of war." Lorenzo stared down at the unconscious woman. She was a civilian, a corporate suit who had dug too deep and found herself swimming with sharks. By all the rules of the life, he should toss her back into the alley and let the predators finish their meal. But the drive at his feet was the holy grail, the key to completely dismantling his enemies. He bent down, elegantly picking up the flash drive, and slipped it into his pocket. "Call Dr. Harrison," Lorenzo ordered, his voice echoing with absolute finality. "Tell him to get to the penthouse immediately. Bring his surgical kit. And Matteo?" "Yeah. Boss, lock down the building. No one gets in or out without my explicit say-so. If the police come knocking, you tell them the ironwood is closed." Chloe awoke to the sharp, pungent scent of rubbing alcohol and the distant, rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor. For a panicked second, she thought she was in a hospital, which meant she was dead. Hayes had men in every major hospital in the city. She shot up with a gasp. But a searing, agonizing fire tore through her right side, forcing her violently back down against the pillows. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Miss Sanders. The stitches are fresh." The voice was calm, deep, and resonated from the shadows to her left. Chloe blinked rapidly, her vision swimming into focus. She wasn't in a hospital. She was in a massive, sprawling bedroom. The walls were lined with dark oak bookshelves. The bed beneath her was vast and covered in high thread count silk sheets, and floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying view of the Chicago skyline, the morning sun just beginning to break over Lake Michigan. Lorenzo Moretti sat in a leather wingback chair near the foot of the bed. He had discarded his suit jacket, his crisp white dress shirt unbuttoned perfectly at the collar, sleeves rolled up to reveal thick, corded forearms, and a flash of a vintage Patek Philippe watch on his wrist. Beside him, a gray-haired man in a blood-stained apron was packing away surgical instruments into a worn black leather bag. "Dr. Harrison managed to extract the bullet," Lorenzo continued, casually crossing one leg over the other. "A 9mm hollow point. Standard issue for Chicago's finest tactical units. You lost a lot of blood, but no major organs were clipped. You are, quite frankly, incredibly lucky." Chloe touched her side, feeling the thick, tight bandaging wrapped tightly around her torso. Her memories of the night came crashing back: the late-night audit at her apartment on Lakeshore Drive, the sudden realization that the numbers didn't just point to embezzlement, but to a massive human trafficking and weapons smuggling ring. The sudden crash of her front door, running barefoot down the fire escape in the freezing rain. "Where is my drive?" Chloe demanded, her voice hoarse, ignoring his commentary on her luck. Lorenzo raised an eyebrow, clearly amused by her audacity. A woman who had nearly bled to death on his floor was now making demands. He reached into his pocket, producing the metallic rectangle, holding it up between his index and middle finger. "Safe," Lorenzo said, "though useless to me without the encryption key you mentioned." "A dead man's switch? You called it?" Chloe swallowed, trying to project a confidence she absolutely did not feel. "It's tied to an algorithm. If I don't input a specific string of code into a remote server every 24 hours, the files corrupt themselves permanently. You can't hack it. It's quantum resistant." Lorenzo leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his dark eyes locking onto hers. The amusement vanished, replaced by the cold, calculating stare of a predator assessing its prey. "You audited the wrong accounts, Chloe. You traced Alderman Hayes's dark money to the Tarasov syndicate. When you realized what you had, you panicked. You didn't run to the police because you saw Hayes having dinner with the police commissioner last week at Gibson's Bar and Steakhouse. Am I close?" Chloe's breath caught. He knew. Of course he knew. He was a kingpin in this city. They sent an assassin. He was wearing a CPD badge. "I barely got out the window, and you chose my club to crash into," Lorenzo mused. "Because you knew I hate the Tarasovs. You knew I'm the only one with the resources to protect you. Are you going to?" she asked, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the silk sheets. Before Lorenzo could answer, a heavy knock echoed through the penthouse doors. Matteo stepped in, his expression grim. "Boss, we have a problem downstairs." Lorenzo didn't break eye contact with Chloe. "Report. 3 CPD cruisers are parked on Wabash. Detective Rollins is at the front door. He's got 6 tactical officers with him. He claims they have footage of a homicide suspect breaking into our alleyway entrance. He's waving a warrant signed by a judge we don't own." Chloe's heart slammed against her ribs. Rollins. That was the man who had kicked down her apartment door. He had tracked her blood trail. "They'll kill me," Chloe whispered, her tough facade finally cracking, genuine terror leaking into her voice. "If they take me out of here, I'll be found hanging in a holding cell by morning." Lorenzo slowly stood up. He adjusted his cuffs, his face an unreadable mask of stone. "Dr. Harrison, stay with the patient," Lorenzo ordered smoothly. "Matteo, you're with me." Lorenzo turned and walked toward the bedroom door. "Moretti!" Chloe called out desperately. "What are you going to do?" Lorenzo paused in the doorway, looking back over his shoulder. The early morning light caught the sharp, dangerous angles of his face. "I'm going to remind Detective Rollins whose city he is currently standing in," Lorenzo said quietly. "You rest, Miss Sanders. No one touches what belongs to me." He shut the door, leaving Chloe alone with the terrifying realization that she had just traded one monster for another. Downstairs in the main lobby of the Ironwood, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Detective Rollins, a burly, red-faced man wearing a cheap off-the-rack trench coat, was pacing impatiently. Behind him stood 6 heavily armored tactical officers, hands resting uneasily on their rifles. Blocking their path to the inner club were 10 of Lorenzo's men, impeccably dressed but radiating lethal intent. The heavy mahogany doors at the top of the grand staircase opened, and Lorenzo descended, step by step, projecting an aura of absolute calm. "Detective Rollins," Lorenzo greeted, his voice echoing in the cavernous room. "To what do I owe the displeasure of an armed invasion at 4 a.m? "Cut the crap, Moretti," Rollins spat, holding up a folded piece of paper. "We tracked a fugitive to your back door. We have street cam footage. She's a suspect in a major homicide. I have a warrant to search this premises." Lorenzo reached the bottom of the stairs and casually walked up to Rollins, stopping just inches from the detective. He didn't look at the warrant. "You have a piece of paper signed by Judge Wallace," Lorenzo said, his voice dropping to a conversational murmur meant only for Rollins. "A judge who, coincidentally, owes a substantial amount of money to the Tarasov family. A debt that, I imagine, Alderman Hayes promised to make disappear if this warrant was signed." Rollins's jaw tightened. "I don't know what you're talking about. Are you interfering with a police investigation?" "I am protecting my legitimate business," Lorenzo countered smoothly. He gestured to Matteo, who handed him a sleek, black smartphone. Lorenzo dialed a number and put it on speaker. It rang twice before it was picked up. "Yes, Mr. Moretti?" A crisp voice answered. "Arthur," Lorenzo said, looking dead into Rollins's eyes. "I have Detective Rollins of the 12th Precinct here, attempting an unlawful search and seizure based on a fraudulent warrant. Could you please advise him?" The voice on the phone belonged to Arthur Sterling, a senior partner at Kirkland & Ellis, and one of the most feared defense attorneys on the Eastern Seaboard. "Detective Rollins." Sterling's voice crackled through the speaker. "If you cross that threshold, I will have an injunction filed before the sun rises. Furthermore, I will personally see to it that Internal Affairs audits your entire unit's financial records for the past 5 years, specifically focusing on your offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. Do we have an understanding?" Rollins turned a shade of pale purple. He looked at Lorenzo's men, who hadn't moved an inch, and then at his own officers, who were clearly outmatched in a potential shootout. "She's dead meat, Moretti," Rollins hissed, leaning in close. "You're starting a war you can't win. Hayes will burn this club to the ground." "Tell Hayes," Lorenzo whispered back, a cold, vicious smile touching his lips, "that if he wants my guest, he'll have to come through me to get her, and I highly suggest he brings an army." Lorenzo ended the call and slipped the phone into his pocket. "Show the detective out, Matteo." He was just leaving. Rollins glared at Lorenzo for a long, heavy moment before sharply gesturing to his men. "Fall back!" he barked, spinning on his heel and marching out the front doors. Lorenzo watched the cruisers pull away through the frosted glass windows. He had just drawn a line in the sand, formally declaring war against the city's political establishment and the Russian mob. And all for an accountant he had met an hour ago. He turned back toward the stairs. It was time to find out exactly what was on that flash drive and how far Chloe Sanders was willing to go to survive. The morning sun cast long, golden shafts of light across the penthouse suite, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Chloe sat propped up against the pillows, an air-gapped ThinkPad laptop resting on her lap. Lorenzo had provided it, at her insistence. The 24-hour window on her dead man's switch was rapidly closing. Lorenzo stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, a fresh tumbler of Macallan, 18 inches his hand, watching the city wake up below. The tension in the room was a living, breathing thing, thick enough to choke on. "You're cutting it close," Lorenzo remarked, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the quiet room. "You have exactly 12 minutes before that drive permanently encrypts itself into a very expensive paperweight." "I am aware of the time, Mr. Moretti," Chloe replied, her fingers flying across the keys with practiced precision despite the lingering tremor in her hands. She winced, a sharp intake of breath escaping her lips as a spasm of pain shot from her sutured side. Lorenzo turned, his dark eyes tracking the movement. He stepped away from the window, closing the distance between them until he was standing over the bed. He smelled of bergamot, expensive leather, and the distinct, metallic tang of gunpowder, a scent that had clung to him since his confrontation with Detective Rollins. "You don't trust me," Lorenzo stated. It wasn't a question. "You're the head of the most notorious crime syndicate in Chicago," Chloe shot back, finally hitting the enter key. The screen flashed green. "Protocol reset. 24 hours remaining. Trusting you would be a catastrophic lapse in judgment. I am utilizing you, just as you are utilizing me to get to Alderman Hayes." A slow, dangerous smile curved Lorenzo's lips. He leaned down, placing one hand on the mattress beside her hip, invading her personal space. Chloe's breath caught, but she forced herself not to shrink back. "Most people who speak to me with such brazen disrespect end up in the trunk of a Lincoln Continental at the bottom of the Chicago River," Lorenzo murmured, his gaze dropping briefly to her lips before meeting her hazel eyes again. "But you have a spine, Miss Sanders. I'll give you that. Survival makes you bold," she whispered, her heart hammering violently against her ribs. Before Lorenzo could respond, the heavy mahogany doors of the penthouse burst open. Matteo strode in, his usually stoic face twisted in a dark scowl. He didn't even apologize for the intrusion. "Boss, we just got hit." Lorenzo straightened instantly, the flirtatious predator vanishing, replaced entirely by the ruthless Don. "Where?" "The import warehouse, out by O'Hare International," Matteo reported, holding out a tablet displaying a live news feed. "2 black SUVs pulled up 10 minutes ago, firebombed the loading bays and gunned down the night crew. It's a total loss. The news is calling it an industrial accident, but our guys on the ground say the shell casings are Russian." Chloe felt the blood drain from her face. "Tarasov," she breathed. Lorenzo took the tablet, his jaw clenching so hard a muscle ticked in his cheek. The Tarasov Bratva, led by the ruthless Nikolai Tarasov, had just escalated a Cold War into a blazing inferno. They were sending a message. "Give us the accountant, or we burn your empire to ash." "They know she's here," Matteo said quietly. "Rollins must have tipped them off the second he left our lobby. The Ironwood is a fortress, Lorenzo. But if they bring heavy artillery, we're sitting ducks in the middle of the loop." Lorenzo handed the tablet back. His mind was already moving 5 steps ahead, calculating casualties, resources, and retaliation. He looked back at Chloe. She looked terrified. But beneath the fear, he saw the gears turning in her analytical mind. She was a liability, yes, but she was also the key to gutting Nikolai Tarasov's financial lifeline. "Pack a bag," Lorenzo ordered her sharply. "We are leaving." "Leaving? To where?" Chloe asked, gripping the laptop tightly. "To a place where the Bratva can't casually drive up and throw Molotov cocktails," Lorenzo replied, grabbing a sleek, black Kevlar vest from the closet. He tossed it onto the bed beside her. "Put that on, over your bandages. It's going to hurt, but not as much as a bullet." 10 minutes later, Chloe was escorted down a private service elevator into the subterranean parking garage. The air was thick with the smell of exhaust and tension. 3 armored Mercedes-Benz G-Class SUVs idled in a tight formation. Heavily armed men in tactical gear moved with terrifying efficiency, sweeping the perimeter. Lorenzo grabbed Chloe's arm gently but firmly, guiding her toward the center vehicle. "Keep your head down," he instructed, opening the heavy reinforced rear door. As they slid into the back seat, Matteo took the wheel. The doors slammed shut with a vault-like thud, sealing them inside a cocoon of bulletproof glass and steel. "Where are we going?" Chloe asked again, shivering despite the climate-controlled interior. Lorenzo reached beneath his seat and pulled out a matte black Sig Sauer P. 365. He expertly checked the chamber before handing it to her. "Grip first. We are going to my private estate in Lake Forest," Lorenzo said softly, his eyes scanning the shadows of the garage as the convoy began to move. "Keep your finger off the trigger until you are ready to kill someone. The safety is already off." The drive north on Route 41 was an exercise in suffocating paranoia. The rain had returned, slicking the highway in a treacherous sheen of black glass. Chloe sat rigidly, the cold steel of the Sig Sauer heavy in her lap. She kept glancing at Lorenzo. He was entirely still, his posture relaxed, but his eyes never stopped tracking the mirrors. They had been driving for 45 minutes, leaving the towering skyline of Chicago behind for the sprawling, wooded wealth of the North Shore. Lake Forest was a haven of old money and sprawling estates, a place where privacy was bought by the acre. "You're quiet," Lorenzo observed, his voice cutting through the hum of the tires. "I'm calculating my odds of surviving the week," Chloe replied dryly, staring out the reinforced window at the blurring trees. "Currently, my statistical models are not optimistic." A low chuckle escaped Lorenzo's chest. "I have never lost an asset I chose to protect, Chloe. Do not insult my track record. You've never had a dirty alderman and the Russian mob actively collaborating to burn your city down because of one auditor," she countered. "There's a first time for everything." The convoy turned off the main highway onto a winding, heavily wooded private road. The GPS signal on the dashboard flickered and died a localized jammer to prevent tracking. They were less than a mile from the estate's main gates. Suddenly, Matteo slammed on the brakes. The heavy SUV skidded, the anti-lock brakes grinding furiously as the vehicle came to a violent halt. Chloe pitched forward, crying out as the seatbelt dug into her wounded side, but Lorenzo's arm shot across her chest, bracing her impact. "Ambush!" Matteo roared over the comm system. A massive, felled oak tree lay directly across the road, blocking their path. Before Matteo could throw the G-Wagon into reverse, the tree line erupted in blinding muzzle flashes. The deafening crack, crack, crack of automatic rifle fire hammered against the SUV. The bulletproof glass spiderwebbed instantly, white pockmarks blooming across the windows as high-caliber rounds tested the vehicle's armor. "Down!" Lorenzo shouted, shoving Chloe to the floorboards. He drew his own weapon, a customized Glock 17, but didn't bother returning fire. Shooting through the armored glass from the inside was impossible without compromising their own protection. "Matteo, push through the tree line. Do not reverse. They'll box us in," Lorenzo ordered, his voice terrifyingly calm amidst the chaos. Matteo yanked the steering wheel hard to the right, flooring the accelerator. The massive SUV roared, tearing through the muddy ditch, snapping saplings, and violently jarring its occupants. Gunfire continued to rain down on them, the metallic pinging sounding like deadly hail. Through the spider-webbed glass, Chloe saw a blacked-out Range Rover emerge from the woods, attempting to T-bone them. Matteo, with the reflexes of a seasoned wheelman, clipped the front of the attacking vehicle, sending it spinning into a ditch. They burst through the tree line and onto the manicured gravel driveway of the Moretti estate. The massive wrought iron gates were already swinging open, operated by guards returning fire from heavily fortified guardhouses. The G-Wagon tore through the entrance, sliding to a halt in front of a sprawling, stone-faced mansion. "Out! Move! Move!" Lorenzo yelled, throwing his door open. He grabbed Chloe, shielding her body with his own as they sprinted up the stone steps. The staccato pop of gunfire echoed from the gates, but the estate's defenses were holding the attackers back. They burst through the double oak doors, into a grand foyer lined with marble and antique armor. Lorenzo slammed the doors shut, throwing 3 deadbolts. He turned to Chloe, his chest heaving, his eyes wild with a feral, protective energy. He ran his hands over her shoulders and arms, checking for blood. "Are you hit? Chloe, look at me. Are you hit?" "No," she gasped, her hands shaking violently as she gripped the Sig Sauer. "No, I'm okay. Just my stitches." Lorenzo exhaled a sharp breath, closing his eyes for a fraction of a second. The relief that washed over his face was genuine, and it startled Chloe more than the gunfire. Matteo burst through a side entrance, bleeding from a superficial cut on his forehead. "Gates are secured. We have 20 heavily armed men on the perimeter. The Russians are falling back." They hit fast and ran. "They knew the route," Lorenzo said, his voice dropping to a deadly, glacial whisper. He turned to Matteo. "They knew exactly where we were going, and exactly which road we were taking." "Boss, that route was blacked out," Matteo said, wiping the blood from his brow. "Only 3 people knew we were moving her here today. Me, you, and Vincent." Vincent, Lorenzo's most trusted capo in charge of the North Side operations. Chloe, still trembling, slowly stood up straight. The fear was draining away, replaced by the cold, familiar logic of numbers and patterns. "You have a leak," she said softly. Lorenzo looked at her. "Vincent has been with my family for 20 years. I need proof before I take a man's head. Do you have a secure terminal here? Something with high-speed access to global financial databases?" Chloe asked, her professional demeanor snapping into place like a suit of armor. 10 minutes later, Chloe was seated in Lorenzo's private study, fingers flying across a customized, multi-monitor trading terminal. Lorenzo and Matteo stood behind her, watching the cascading lines of data reflect in her hazel eyes. "If the Tarasovs bought a capo," Chloe murmured, her eyes darting across the screens. "They didn't hand him a briefcase full of cash. It's too risky. They would route it through a shell corporation. Nikolai Tarasov favors a specific laundering technique through a bank in Cyprus." She cross-referenced the routing numbers she had memorized from Alderman Hayes's audit, with recent real estate and holding company transactions tied to Chicago's North Side. The tension in the room was absolute. "Got it," Chloe said, hitting a final keystroke. A complex web of transactions appeared on the main screen, highlighting a massive deposit made just 3 hours prior. $2 million, Chloe pointed to the screen. Wired from Red Star Holdings in Nicosia, Cyprus, into a domestic LLC registered in Delaware. The LLC is named Vincenzo Logistics. The sole proprietor is Vincent Carbone. The silence in the study was deafening. The accountant had just done in 10 minutes what Lorenzo's internal enforcers couldn't do in months. She had definitively unmasked a traitor. Lorenzo stared at the screen, a dark, terrifying storm brewing in his eyes. He slowly reached out, placing his hand gently on Chloe's shoulder. The touch was warm, grounding, but carried the weight of impending violence. "Matteo," Lorenzo said, his voice devoid of all emotion. "Find Vincent. Bring him to the basement." "Right away, boss," Matteo said, his face hard as he left the room. Lorenzo looked down at Chloe. The dynamic had fundamentally shifted. She was no longer just a damsel in distress or a walking hard drive. She was a lethal asset. "You just saved my life, Chloe Sanders," Lorenzo murmured, his thumb lightly brushing the fabric of her shirt near her collarbone. "And you have officially made yourself indispensable to the Moretti family. I hope you understand exactly what that means." Chloe looked up into his dark eyes, the gravity of her new reality settling over her. She had survived the night, but she had just permanently tied her soul to the devil. "It means," she whispered, "that Alderman Hayes and Nikolai Tarasov have no idea what's coming for them." When Lorenzo returned from the basement an hour later, the atmosphere in the study shifted palpably. He moved with the same predatory grace, his tailored shirt perfectly pressed, but there was a faint, unmistakable smear of crimson across his right knuckle. He poured himself 2 fingers of Macallan, his face an unreadable mask of cold, calculated resolve. Vincent Carbone's treason had been dealt with permanently. Chloe sat rigidly before the terminal, her hazel eyes fixed on the blinking countdown timer on her laptop screen. 0 hours, 14 minutes, and 32 seconds remaining. 14 minutes until the encryption permanently locked. He confessed, Lorenzo stated, his voice a low, gravelly timbre that commanded the room. Vincent sold our transport routes to Nikolai Tarasov for $2 million and the promise of a quiet retirement in Monaco. But he gave us something far more valuable before he expired. He gave us Tarasov's current location and the alderman's escape plan. Chloe turned in her leather chair, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Hayes is running? Rollins informed him about your survival and the failure of the ambush, Lorenzo explained, taking a slow sip of his bourbon. Hayes is currently packing his private jet at Midway International. He plans to flee to a non-extradition country before the sun fully rises. Tarasov, however, is mobilizing his remaining enforcers. He intends to strike this estate with everything he has in less than 30 minutes. He believes we are blind and bleeding. A heavy silence fell over the study. The end game was here. The chessboard was set, and there was no room left for pawns, only kings and queens. We have to strike first, Chloe said, the tremor in her voice completely gone, replaced by a razor-sharp clarity. She looked at the drive connected to the terminal. If I unlock this now, I can't just hand it to the local authority.